There's something that many avoidant individuals quietly hope for after they push you away, but they would never say it out loud because it doesn't sound logical on the surface. Deep down, what they often long for is for you to respond in a way that resembles the emotional pattern they experienced with their early caregiver, especially their mother figure. Let me set the scene a bit. I was hosting one of my weekly live sessions inside my private community. It's something I do every Thursday where people come in and ask questions about relationships, breakups, and especially avoidant dynamics. It's usually a space full of emotional stories, confusion, and people trying to understand someone who suddenly pulled away. That day, someone named Ed brought up something I hadn't heard before. He asked if I was familiar with what he called the cat allergy analogy. I hadn't, so he offered to message me the details. When I read what he sent, it completely shifted the way I looked at avoidance. He described something he referred to as a kind of physical response pattern. Just like someone who has a cat allergy doesn't choose to sneeze, tear up, or struggle to breathe, an avoidant person doesn't consciously choose to feel overwhelmed by closeness either. Instead, when emotional intimacy rises too quickly, their system reacts automatically. It can feel like suffocation, pressure, or emotional overload, even if nothing objectively threatening is happening. The important part is that this reaction is not fully intentional. It's not a decision. It's a nervous system response that has been conditioned over time. Their body and mind interpret closeness as something that requires escape, not engagement. After reading that, something clicked for me, especially when I connected it with something I had come across earlier that same week. There's a well-known principle in neuroscience that says the more two things fire together in the brain, the more strongly they become connected. Over time, the brain reinforces repeated experiences and starts filtering out what it doesn't see often. It's a kind of efficiency system. It strengthens the familiar and weakens the unfamiliar. This idea was demonstrated in a famous experiment with kittens conducted by researcher Colin Blakemore. In that study, very young kittens were raised in controlled environments where their visual world was extremely limited. Some were exposed only to vertical stripes everywhere they looked. As they grew, their brains adapted so strongly to that pattern that when they were later placed in a normal environment, they literally couldn't perceive horizontal movement properly. Things that moved sideways or lines that ran left to right were almost invisible to them. Then the experiment was reversed. Other kittens were raised in environments filled only with horizontal patterns, and those animals later struggled to recognize vertical shapes. Their perception had been shaped entirely by what their brains had repeatedly experienced during early development. The lesson was simple but powerful. The brain doesn't just observe reality, it learns it, filters it, and builds expectations based on repetition. Now, when we bring this back to human attachment, especially avoidant attachment, it starts to make more sense. Attachment patterns begin forming very early in life, often within the first year. For someone with avoidant tendencies, the early emotional environment often includes inconsistency. A caregiver may be physically present, but emotionally unavailable. Needs might be met in a functional way, but without warmth, comfort, or emotional attunement. Sometimes the caregiver disappears emotionally at key moments, even if they are still physically in the room. Over time, the child learns a very specific internal rule. Closeness doesn't equal safety. Emotional needs don't always get met, and depending on others too much leads to disappointment or emotional withdrawal. So the nervous system adapts. It learns distance instead of closeness, independence instead of reliance, emotional suppression instead of expression. This is where the connection to their mother or primary caregiver becomes important. The early emotional blueprint often includes a figure who was inconsistent, sometimes available, sometimes absent, sometimes warm, sometimes distant. That unpredictability becomes the foundation of what love feels like in their system. So when an avoidant person rejects intimacy and you suddenly step back or disappear, something interesting happens internally. Even though it looks like rejection on the surface, to their nervous system it can feel strangely familiar. Not necessarily comforting or healthy, but recognizable. It mirrors the emotional pattern they grew up with. This is why, on a subconscious level, many avoidant individuals are drawn to what feels familiar, even if it is emotionally uncomfortable. Familiarity often registers as normal, even when it isn't good for them. And this is also why emotional reactions in these dynamics are so confusing. What feels like abandonment to one person can feel like relief or recognition to another, not because it is right, but because it matches an old internal template. In my review of over 100 real cases from people who managed to reconnect with avoidant partners after breakups, one pattern stood out more than anything else. It wasn't chasing, pleading, or over-explaining that made the difference. It was emotional stability after the breakup. A kind of grounded detachment where the person stopped reacting from panic and started responding from self-possession. That shift changes everything, because it no longer feeds the old cycle. Instead, it introduces something unfamiliar, calm presence without emotional pressure. And for someone whose entire emotional blueprint was built around inconsistency, that kind of steady presence can be far more impactful than anything dramatic. And maybe no one illustrates this shift more clearly than Lauren. I kind of reached a point where I just accepted it. I told myself, if I don't get him back, I'll be okay. So I came to this fork in the road where I had to choose. Either I fully move on, or I reach out one last time. Because during the breakup, one of the last things he said was, maybe I just need some time. But after hearing about these cat experiments, I started questioning whether I misunderstood what was really going on. When you listen to stories like Lauren's, it makes you rethink everything we assume about avoidant behavior. Because what if the thing we've been calling genuine emotional detachment isn't actually detachment in the way people think? What if it's something closer to a return to what feels familiar? Think about it in terms of a pattern. Let's map out what a typical relationship experience can look like for someone with avoidant tendencies. At first, everything feels exciting. They want connection. They want love. They enter the relationship believing things will be different this time. Then slowly, things begin to shift. Small signs of discomfort appear. Emotional expectations start to feel heavier. They start thinking about distance. Then they begin pulling away. Eventually, they leave. And right after leaving, there's often a noticeable sense of relief. Almost like a weight has been lifted. A feeling of, finally, I can breathe again. But that relief doesn't last forever, because after a while something else creeps in. Loneliness, confusion, and even self-questioning. Why does this keep happening? Why can't I make relationships work? So what looks like a simple relationship cycle is actually something deeper. From early stages up until the breakup, they're moving through emotional territory that conflicts with their internal baseline. For them, emotional closeness isn't the baseline. Emotional distance is. That's where the cat allergy idea starts to connect again. The nervous system reacts to intimacy like it's something overwhelming, not because they consciously reject love, but because their system learned early on that closeness equals pressure, unpredictability, or emotional risk. And that learning usually comes from the earliest environment they experienced, often shaped by a caregiver who was inconsistent, present, but not emotionally attuned, sometimes warm, sometimes distant, sometimes responsive, sometimes absent. So over time, the brain builds a model. Independence feels safe, while closeness feels destabilizing. This is why when the relationship ends and distance returns, it doesn't just feel like freedom, it can feel like a return to something familiar, a kind of internal reset. Not happiness exactly, but recognition, like stepping back into an old emotional environment their nervous system already understands. That's also why what I used to call the separation elation phase may not just be celebration of independence. It may actually be a return to emotional normalcy, the state their system learned to survive in. But there's another layer to this that makes everything more complicated. Because humans aren't only shaped by experience, we're also wired for connection at a biological level. As John Bowlby, the founder of attachment theory, described, the drive to form emotional bonds is a core part of human nature. We are built to connect, to rely on others, and to form emotional safety through relationships. So now you have two forces pulling in opposite directions. On one side, there's the learned pattern: stay independent, don't rely too much, distance equals safety. On the other side, there's biology: connect, bond, attach. You are not meant to do life alone. That internal contradiction is where avoidant behavior becomes so confusing, because part of them genuinely seeks closeness, while another part reacts to it like a threat. And this is where someone like Lauren, in that moment of letting go, unintentionally changes the entire emotional equation. When she says, "I'm okay either way," something important shifts. The pressure disappears, the emotional demand drops, the dynamic stops feeling like pursuit versus retreat. And suddenly, the avoidance system is no longer overwhelmed, but also no longer being chased. In that space, something interesting can happen. They may feel both safety and space at the same time. Space to regulate themselves, and enough emotional safety that connection no longer feels like pressure. That combination is rare in their internal world, and based on what I've seen across more than 100 different cases, this is often the point where reconnection becomes possible, not because of chasing or persuasion, but because the emotional environment has fundamentally changed. Now, of course, hearing this usually creates a misunderstanding. Most people think, okay, so I just detach and everything works. But real emotional detachment is not a tactic. It's not something you perform to trigger a response. It's a shift in internal state, and that's where it gets difficult. Because knowing what to do and actually living it are two completely different things. Even I notice this in myself sometimes. I'll say I don't want to engage with certain patterns, like reading comment sections, but I still get pulled in. Not because I don't understand it, but because attention doesn't always follow logic. It follows wiring. And that's the real takeaway here. Awareness is easy, regulation is harder, and behavior change is the hardest of all. Most people understand, at a logical level, that avoidant partners need space. But when emotions are involved, especially attachment and fear of loss, acting on that knowledge becomes a completely different challenge. In psychology, there's a well-known study called the still face experiment. In it, a parent sits with their infant and is instructed to suddenly stop responding. No facial expression, no eye contact, no emotional reaction at all. Within seconds, the baby changes. At first, it tries to reconnect. It smiles, reaches out, makes sounds, does everything it knows how to do to regain the parent's attention. But when nothing comes back, the distress escalates quickly. The infant becomes unsettled, then panicked, because its entire sense of safety depends on emotional feedback from the caregiver. This reaction is not random, it's deeply wired. Babies don't have a fully formed internal system for regulating emotion. They rely on external cues. A caregiver's face, tone, and presence tell them, "Am I safe? What am I feeling? What is happening right now?" There's also a more extreme modern interpretation of this same principle seen in viral social experiments, where parents fake a sudden injury response in front of their child. Even when nothing has actually happened, the infant still cries or becomes distressed, not because of physical pain, but because they are reading the caregiver's emotional state. If the caregiver looks alarmed, the child assumes danger exists. Across both examples, the pattern is the same. The child is constantly scanning the caregiver for emotional signals. Their nervous system is built around attunement. But here's where the misunderstanding often begins. Avoidant individuals are not simply the opposite of this system, but they often appear that way on the surface. Because instead of amplifying distress when emotional signals disappear, they appear to shut down. When emotional intensity rises or when pursuit becomes stronger, their system doesn't escalate in the same visible way. Instead, it often retreats. This is why Mary Ainsworth's strange situation experiment is so important. In that study, infants between 12 and 18 months were observed as their caregiver left a room and then returned. The key observation wasn't just the separation, it was the reunion. Secure infants showed distress when the caregiver left, but were quickly soothed upon return. Anxious infants became highly distressed and struggled to regulate even when the caregiver came back. Avoidant infants, however, appeared unusually independent. They didn't cry much, didn't move toward the caregiver, and seemed emotionally unaffected. But physiological data told a different story. Their stress responses, heart rate, cortisol levels, showed activation beneath the surface. They weren't calm. They were suppressing visible distress. This is where things become more complex in adult attachment, because what looks like emotional detachment is often a learned adaptation, not the absence of emotion itself. It's a strategy developed early in life when emotional expression did not reliably bring comfort, consistency, or response. So the system learns: don't reach, don't show need, don't depend. Now, when you map that forward into adult relationships, a predictable cycle begins to appear. When closeness increases, the avoidance system becomes activated. When pressure increases, it withdraws. When the relationship ends, something interesting happens. The nervous system often shifts into relief, not necessarily joy, but a reduction in internal pressure. And this is where many people misinterpret the dynamic. It can look like the avoidant doesn't care, when in reality their system is returning to a familiar baseline: distance, autonomy, emotional self-containment. That familiar state can feel regulating simply because it is known, not because it is fulfilling. But as attachment theory suggests, humans are not designed for permanent disconnection. Even individuals with strong avoidant patterns still carry the biological drive for bonding. That tension between learned independence and biological connection creates an internal push-pull that can surface later as confusion, longing, or emotional contradiction. Now, if someone responds to an avoidant rejection by panicking, chasing, or escalating emotional intensity, it often reinforces the avoidant's expectation that closeness equals pressure. It confirms the original internal model. But if the response shifts, if the person steps back, stabilizes emotionally, and stops reacting from urgency, it changes the emotional environment entirely. Not as a strategy, but as a shift in relational tone. At that point, something subtle happens in perception. The avoidant no longer experiences pursuit, but they also no longer experience emotional pressure. What replaces it is space without demand, and that combination can challenge their internal expectations because it doesn't match the pattern they are used to. Across many real-life reconnection stories, this shift often appears not as a technique, but as a byproduct of emotional regulation, when one person stops operating from panic and returns to self-stability. People often misunderstand this part. They assume it means do nothing and they come back. But emotional systems don't respond to formulas. They respond to consistency, tone, and perceived safety. And most importantly, they respond to whether the old cycle is being repeated or something new is quietly replacing it. When we go back to Jenny's story, something important stands out again. Her avoidant partner was expecting a very specific emotional pattern after the breakup. In his mind, he likely assumed she would fall apart the way she had in the past: anxious, reactive, emotionally unsettled, reaching out or trying to fix things. That was his internal reference point for how she would respond. But instead, he was met with something completely different. She appeared calm, composed, grounded, even genuinely okay. And that difference created a kind of emotional disruption in his expectations, not in a dramatic sense, but in a subtle psychological one. The internal script he had built about her no longer matched reality. That mismatch is often what begins the second phase of the avoidance cycle. This phase can be thought of as a period of emotional settling, what I've described before as basking in comfort. One of the most common misunderstandings here is the belief that once an avoidance perception shifts, everything immediately changes, as if one realization leads straight back to reconnection. But that's not how the system works. After a breakup, there's usually a necessary period where the avoidant retreats into solitude. not as punishment and not as strategy, but as regulation. Their nervous system is recalibrating back to what feels familiar: autonomy, distance, self-containment. This is where the internal conflict slowly begins to build again. On one side, there's relief, space, freedom from emotional intensity or perceived pressure. On the other side, there's an underlying biological drive for connection that doesn't disappear just because it's been avoided. We've talked about this as a paradox, and that's really what it is. Two competing systems operating at the same time, one learned through early emotional conditioning, and one built into human attachment biology. In real life, this phase often looks like withdrawal first. Jenny described how her partner went completely quiet after the breakup. No contact, no engagement, just silence. On the surface, it looks like indifference, but in reality, it's often a form of emotional reset. Then comes something more subtle. Even without direct interaction, there is still observation. Curiosity doesn't disappear just because engagement stops. Many people in these dynamics later realize their avoidant partner was still indirectly checking in, watching from a distance, trying to make sense of the shift. At this stage, the emotional comfort of distance begins to mix with uncertainty. Because while solitude feels regulating, it also raises questions, especially when the other person is no longer reacting in the expected way. That's when the internal narrative starts to shift again, not fully toward reconnection yet, but toward reflection. Questions begin to form. Was leaving the right decision? Did I misread something? Why does this feel different than I expected? This is where the third phase begins to emerge, the push toward reconnection, not from pressure, but from internal contradiction. You can think of it as a cycle between two states, one where distance feels safe and one where connection starts to feel necessary again. Each state takes its turn, depending on emotional pressure and internal regulation. In Jenny's case, something notable happened during this stage. Instead of chasing or trying to re-establish contact, she maintained distance, not in a performative way, not as a tactic, but as a natural continuation of her own emotional stability. She didn't escalate pursuit. She didn't try to force clarity. And that changed the entire dynamic. Because when the expected emotional reaction doesn't appear, the system on the other side begins to adjust. Not immediately and not predictably, but gradually. At one point, he reached out and suggested meeting again. And what stood out wasn't just the message itself, but the tone behind it. There was hesitation mixed with availability, a kind of careful openness that hadn't been there before. When she responded calmly and didn't rush toward him, the dynamic shifted again. The urgency wasn't met with urgency. The pressure wasn't met with pressure. Instead, there was space. And that space matters more than most people realize. Because psychologically, what changes everything in moments like this is not intensity, not confrontation, and not even clarity in the traditional sense. It is the absence of the old emotional pattern, the familiar rhythm that both people have been unconsciously playing out over and over again suddenly stops repeating in the same way. In most relationships involving avoidant dynamics, there is a predictable loop that forms. One person moves closer, emotionally or physically. The avoidant system feels that increase in closeness as pressure or expectation. In response, they pull back to restore internal balance. That withdrawal creates anxiety in the other person, who then moves closer again, trying to re-establish connection, and the cycle continues. Over time, that loop becomes the emotional language of the relationship. Even when nothing is being said directly, both nervous systems recognize the pattern instantly. It becomes automatic, familiar, almost reflexive. And here's the key point. The nervous system doesn't just respond to people, it responds to patterns. So when the pattern stays the same for too long, pursue, withdraw, panic, distance, repeat, it becomes the baseline expectation of the relationship. Even conflict becomes predictable. Even emotional intensity becomes familiar. The system knows what comes next, even if it's uncomfortable. But when that repetition breaks, something subtle but powerful happens. The brain can no longer predict the next emotional move with confidence. The expected response does not arrive. The familiar emotional pressure is not met with the usual reaction. The system is suddenly placed in a situation where its internal map is no longer accurate, and psychologically, that creates a moment of recalibration. Not necessarily comfort, not necessarily panic, but uncertainty. For an avoidant system in particular, this is significant because so much of their emotional regulation is built around predictability through distance. Distance feels safe because it is familiar, it is structured, it does not demand immediate emotional engagement or vulnerability. But when the other person stops participating in the old cycle, stops chasing, stops reacting, stops escalating, the environment changes. Not in an obvious, dramatic way, but in a quiet, structural one. The emotional feedback loop collapses. There is no longer a consistent signal saying, "You move away, I come closer," or "You withdraw, I pursue." That script is no longer being performed in the same rhythm. And when a deeply ingrained relational script stops playing out, the mind is forced to observe rather than react. This is where real psychological movement begins, because now the avoidance system is no longer just responding, it is processing. It starts to register differences. This is not how it used to go. Why is there no reaction? Why is the emotional pressure gone, but I still notice something is different? And that gap between expectation and reality is where re-evaluation begins. Importantly, this does not automatically lead to reconnection. It does not guarantee change, but it does interrupt automaticity. And in attachment-based behavior, interruption is the first real opening for awareness. Without interruption, the system stays on autopilot. With interruption, the system becomes conscious of itself. That is why the absence of the familiar pattern can sometimes be more impactful than any emotional effort to fix it. Because the goal is no longer to create intensity, but to remove predictability. When predictability is removed, the emotional environment becomes unfamiliar. And when something feels unfamiliar, the mind naturally starts to reassess it, even if only subtly at first. So the real shift is not happening in grand gestures or emotional speeches. It is happening in the silence, where the old cycle used to live.